Hello and welcome to Demystifying Poetry, the podcast that brings everyone closer to poets and poems. I am your host, Tara Stubbs, and today I'm delighted to say that my guest is Dr. Dinah Roe. Hello, Dinah.
Hello, Tara. Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Dinah Roe is reader in English literature at Oxford Brookes University, specialising in pre-Raphaelitism and Victorian poetry. She is currently editing Christina Rossetti's complete poems for the Longman Annotated English Poets series and is working on a British Academy-funded project examining the connections between Rossetti's creativity and her work as a carer. I invited you here because I was really interested in your projects around poetry and care, and I noticed also that you do workshops for carers in which you talk about writing poetry as well. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Sure. So the workshops are given over a period of 4 weeks, and we give everybody an hour and a half each week. They all take place online because they were designed with carers in mind. And that way they don't have to leave the person they're responsible for. And they can attend, but they can sort of come and go as needs be. So we meet an hour and a half over 4 weeks, and we do poetry exercises. So we read some poems, not necessarily about care, but often. And we give them prompts, and they write their own poems about care as well. The other person who leads the workshop is called Sarah Hesketh, who is a wonderful poet herself. So she's in the position to really help and nurture our poets. What I do is a sort of more academic side of things. I talk about Christina Rossetti, a Victorian poet who was also a carer. And I talk more about the kind of technical academic side of poetry. And then she does the creative side. So it's sort of nice cop and nicer cop, I guess is our dynamic.
So is that how you got into this topic around caring? Is that through Christina Rossetti?
Yes.
Because I'm not sure everybody who's listening would know that Rossetti was a carer.
Yeah, well, I didn't really know Christina Rossetti was a carer, which is a disgrace because I've written a biography about her and her family. But it's something that, much like care itself, it's slightly invisible, particularly in literary figures, I've noticed. So that's my new area of
fascinating
interest. Because literary figures, they don't kind of tend to be out about being carers.
No.
They don't really recognize themselves as carers, which is something they have in common with today's carers.
Yeah, sometimes it has to be spelled out for them.
Yeah. Well, it's this thing you just do. You just do this for your family or your loved ones. But actually, it's a big deal. It's an enormous part of your life.
Yeah. So in what ways was Rossetti a carer then?
So she was what we would call now a young carer for her father, Gabriele, when he had a mental and physical breakdown. She was about 13, 14.
Gosh.
Everybody else in the family had to go out to work, and she was too young, so she stayed home and looked after her father and experienced lots of mental health difficulties herself, unsurprisingly.
Yeah, I imagine she didn't have any training with that role.
No training or support or any recognition, really, in those days that was even a role. Although, again, something she shares with young carers today.
And I was talking to Carol Jacobi about the fact that Rossetti later worked with prostituted women, didn't she? Do you think the things are linked?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that fascinates me about her work with, what were called, and in those days, fallen women, was when she was working in those institutions. She actually made a deal with them. She was doing a sort of residential work, so she was living there for a bit. And she said, I'll do that, but only if you give me time to write. And so it's interesting how writing and caring are happening side by side for her, even later on. Then much later in her life, she becomes a carer for her 2 aunts and her mother, all 3 of whom are in their 80s.
Wow.
She's in her 50s and has health problems herself, also very common among carers today. And she's looking after all of them.
And why did it fall to her? Just gender roles or?
Gender roles, and also she never married.
Mm-hmm.
So she didn't have a nuclear family of her own. So it was about availability as well.
And do you think that's influenced her poetry in different ways?
Absolutely. So once you look at Rossetti's poetry through a caring lens, you can see it in a different way. I mean, if Goblin Market isn't about caring, I don't know what is. So this is about two sisters. One of them goes off the rails and the other one has to save her. And then at the end of the poem, they have a little chant which they pass on to their children about how you have to care for others. And
I'd not thought about it in that way before.
Me neither. So it's, or think about her most famous poem, In the Bleak Midwinter. And at the heart of that poem, you've got an act of care. You've got the Virgin Mary breastfeeding her child. And she says that that's enough for him, is, the mother's milk and the act of care. And that's more important, she says, than the angels and the kings who surround him to worship him.
And it's interesting you're talking about that maternal figure, because there's quite a lot of discussion at the moment, isn't there, about a very narrow idea of what constitutes somebody being maternal. I think with, all the press that Kamala Harris has had, for example, because she hasn't birthed children.
Yeah.
Do you think that Rossetti speaks to that as well?
Oh, absolutely. She's explicit about that in some of her prose works. So she writes all these works of devotional prose, which of course mixed with poetry. So she says, I write prose and help myself forward with bits of verse. And in those books, she actually says there are more ways for women to be mothers.
Wow.
And she said, she uses all sorts of Bible quotes and then says, women, can be everybody's mother. Women can take care without actually being biological mothers. And it's a dereliction of duty, sort of not to care.
That's really interesting. And so would this have been around 1850-ish or so when she was writing this, or a bit later?
Oh, much later. So this is towards the end of her life.
Okay.
So this is in the 1880s.
Okay. I was just thinking because, often these issues have already been discussed, but we think they're fresh now. But actually, she was discussing it 140 years ago.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I think we have that. So sometimes we have, particularly around discussions around being mothers, I think sometimes we find that people are saying, this is a taboo, no one's ever talked about it before, but actually you can find lots of evidence for people having talked about it for centuries sometimes.
Yes.
It's always been the same issues for women, essentially. Yeah. Just in different guises, I think.
Absolutely. And she writes about it again in her nursery rhymes called Sing Song. So she writes these in kind of the 1870s. And she addresses things like adoptive motherhood very positively.
Oh, wow.
Very positively. And, it's interesting because these poems are targeted at children, so you have those positive messages. That's also, Sing Song is also a book full of poems about care. It's about caring for the elderly, caring for animals, caring for children. Once you start to look at it that way, you can't stop seeing it.
And do you use those poems then in the workshops? Is that the kind of academic side?
Yes.
And how have they gone down with the...
Really, really well.
Good.
I think what using Christina Rossetti helps to do is because she's a canonical poet, which many people do know, even if they think they don't. If you say In the Bleak Midwinter, then everyone goes, oh, yes. And if you say, look, there's a canonical poet who was also a full-time carer and wrote about it, this is something you can write about. And write about really, really well, just like she did.
I was having a look at the online anthology, collection they put together from the workshops, and there's some really beautiful work in there, isn't there? What is that from? From the training in the workshops, or was it that people already had it in them to write like that?
Well, that's
hard to say. I guess
it's a mix.
Yeah.
So, people who come to the workshops, some people have never written in their lives, or poetry. And some people are poets already. So it sort of depends.
Right.
But one of the most surprising things from the workshop, and I'm ashamed to say this, I was so surprised at the wonderful poetry that people produced and the way they were able to produce amazing bits of work in kind of, 15, 20 minutes. Just beautiful, which of course they then worked on and
Do you
improved.
think it's because perhaps sometimes as academics we have biases about things like that we think you have to learn your craft, you have to be a reader to be a writer, you can't just do this quickly. It's it's a creative process. Is that why?
I think the bias I had about it in the beginning was that writing, because it is for me, is a solitary activity. And these workshops have taught me that writing can be communal. So the feedback I got from the workshops, most people said what they really valued was the writing community of carers. So people to encourage you and help you and who had similar experiences, so you're free to sort of be yourself around them. And your writing is free to be itself around them. And it's made me think about writing and caring in a really different way.
Yeah, I was thinking it must have kind of evolved your thinking about it.
Yeah, completely.
How did you find the people to do the workshop, to be involved in the workshops, the carers? Was that difficult?
That's a great question. I can't even remember now. It's one of those projects that it now has a life of its own.
Exactly.
So it's just so easy for me because we made connections and partnerships with other organizations. So say the Arvon Foundation, Carers UK, Carers Oxfordshire. So now it's kind of out there and easy to. I can't even remember in the beginning how I did. I think it was kind of just Twitter and the Oxford Brookes Poetry Centre, and just putting it out there.
So is it people who are self-identifying as carers, or people who've been referred, or a mix, or?
A mix.
Yeah. And is there a definition of what caring means?
Yeah, there's an NHS definition which we use, and it's something like I can't remember it word for word in my head right now, but it's something like if you look after a person who couldn't look after themselves without your help, and also you have to be unpaid.
Right.
So these workshops are also it's unpaid carers that we're aiming at.
So did you find different attitudes around poetry during these workshops or during this project? Or were most people quite positive about it?
There were different attitudes. I remember in the first workshop we did, and Sarah and I were just quite nervous because you just don't know what's going to happen. And there were a couple of people, there was one person in particular who just said, I've never really read poetry, I've never looked at poetry, I've no idea.
So why would they there?
And because they'd heard about it.
Yeah. But that's really great actually that you're getting people like that to come.
And she was wonderful. She was a really good poet. She's still writing poetry to this day. And it was actually one of her poems that I took to be the title of our anthology, I Sing, Therefore I Am. That was a line from one of her poems, and she was
that's lovely,
absolutely marvelous.
And do you think it's partly as well because you were talking about community, that it's a sort of safe space as well? It must be wonderful for people to meet people local to them even who are in a similar position. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was everybody did describe it as a safe space, and we made a lot of effort to make sure that it was. So when we introduce the workshops, Sarah always says to everyone, if you need a break, if this gets a bit too emotional, if it's too hard, please just turn your camera off, turn the thing off, come back when you're ready.
Yeah.
It's fine. And all the feedback we got said people felt kind of safe and confident in the space. And in terms of publishing the poem, of course, we get everyone's permission. And some people want to remain anonymous. Some people want to put their names to that. And that's completely up to them.
I ran a workshop last year that was involving people who unfortunately had themselves been in care and had been abused in care. And when we were planning it with the charity who was kind of co-running it with me, there was a lot of discussion about the choice of materials. And there was actually quite a lot of, well, censorship is a strong word, but it felt a little bit like there were only a handful of poems you could actually look at safely. Did you have a similar fear or concern?
Well, interestingly, that's where Carers Oxfordshire has been really helpful to us. So I've got lots of advice from them about how to create a supportive environment. Yeah. And I can refer anybody who's taken our workshops onto them if it's really because good. A lot of things will come up. But what we found was kind of, rather than being triggered or hugely upset by dealing with that kind of material, carers were relieved that finally they could talk about it. Finally they could look it in its face and really discuss how they felt with other carers. I think that's why it's important to keep it.
And do you know if they've kept in touch?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes, they have. Some people have started their own groups, their own kind of poetry for carers groups.
That's brilliant.
And yeah, they've really, there have been some good friendships arising out of it. And as you say, in terms of the experiences of abuse, we've come across that as well in workshops that people have talked about. We find that each workshop has a kind of flavor. So, one of the workshops we did, everyone was just like super lovely and positive about caring and loved the people they cared for. And it was great and transformative. And then there was another workshop, it was like the angry workshop. Yeah. Where everyone was just furious.
I hate this.
And had a terrible old time. Yeah. And was,
it's cathartic almost.
Yeah. Yeah. So
and were a lot of, I imagine, is it fair to say that quite a lot of those people would have been women? Or is that?
Yes, the majority of people who came to us were women, but we have had some men as well.
That's good. I was just interested when you think about anger, because I've been thinking a lot recently about women's anger. Yeah. That's why I was asking about gender, because it does feel like that's something that often women feel like they can't express, that it makes them a bad person. If they say, this makes me unhappy, it's not fair.
Yeah.
And there's nowhere to put those kinds of feelings.
Yes, and poetry, people did find that was a good place for that, I think.
That's really good. Just to change the subject slightly, I'm interested in your relationship with poetry as well. I know as an academic, sometimes if you make your hobby your job, it's quite hard to go back to that hobby. Sometimes, I'm doing a poetry podcast, and when I think about it, I think, how often do I actually sit and read poetry in my spare time? What is your relationship with poetry and reading, writing poetry yourself?
Yes, first off, I do wish somebody had warned me about the turning your hobby into a job.
No, it's not great.
Hazard. It's an interesting one.
Yeah.
I read whenever I can. I mean, I'm reading for work, as I'm sure you are.
Yes.
Constantly.
Yes.
And actually, I really enjoy reading poetry for work.
Me too, actually. Yeah.
And for teaching. Because the wonderful thing about teaching kind of the same poems over years is I'm a different person every time I come back to it.
It's true, yeah. And you see different things, which is quite shocking if you've been teaching it for 10 years or something.
Yes, I feel quite foolish sometimes. I think, how did I not notice that? And
there's something quite discreet about that as well, isn't there? That you can, for me, it's much more manageable to teach a poem than, say, a novel.
Oh, yeah.
Where do you start with a novel?
Oh, completely. Well, that's why I teach poetry.
Yeah.
It's completely why I teach. Also, if no one's done the reading, you can make them do it right there.
Exactly. You can't get out of it. Give them 5 minutes. Yeah.
It's 14 lines. Come on.
But yeah, I mean, do you think, it's interesting because I was reading the other day that apparently it's been one of the best years for poetry sales in the last year, but it's still very small and it's still quite niche. But a lot of that has to do with things like Insta poetry and online poetry. Is that something that you engage with at all yourself? Because I mean, you're very big on X, which was Twitter. You use that a lot, don't you, for your workshops and things? But do you use it as a place to read or encounter poetry yourself?
No, not so much. I'm very much a fan of the material text. I like books. I like paper. I like there are all these studies about reading proper text, proper material text on paper, and how it makes your brain work better. And how I don't know. There's some sort of connections. I don't know. I'm not a neurologist, but I actually believe that I need the stillness. I also need physiologically the lack of light. Like backlit stuff just kills me and gives me headaches, and I can't properly read.
So not Kindles or anything like that?
No, oh no.
Is it all right that I'm not embarrassing you to say that I saw you with a map of Oxford earlier in your
Yes, you know I'm telling the truth.
I haven't seen anyone with a map of Oxford for a long time.
This isn't just my like ancient lady pose. This is
no, you're seeing it through, you know, that's your authentic self. And I'm really interested just because of this, the particular topic for this podcast is about, from all of your experiences, whether at university or in your projects, what do you think we can do to kind of help people get closer to poetry, to kind of get over those threshold issues that people have around it? What would be your takeaways from these things?
I think we need to make poetry more of a part of public life. One of the things I love as an initiative is Poems on the Underground.
Yeah.
Because you're sitting on the underground, you know, you can read, I don't know, an ad for wigs or nose hair remover, or, you know, a lovely poem. And I like Poems on the Underground because it's really thought about the space it's in and how much time people are going to have to read it, and you know,
and it takes up a similar space to the ads, doesn't it? So yes. You just find your eyes wandering.
Yeah. And then those lines, and then I think people probably have time. Yeah. Because one of the other fascinations I have is time. So, you know, in terms of reading. So how I got into this project was I was reading Christina Rossetti's book called Time Flies, which she wrote in 1885. And this was about when she's becoming a carer for her two aunts and mother. And suddenly she starts writing in this really different way. And she's writing really short entries of prose, and then sometimes a poem, and really short. So it's a daily reading diary. So she writes one entry for each day. And I thought, why has she suddenly started writing in this extraordinary manner? And then I thought, oh, she's become a carer.
That's all the time she has.
Yep. So she's fitting it in.
Wow. Yeah.
So a daily entry, she can do that. She can do it. She can somehow do a daily entry.
And it sort of tells you how important she found it then as well, that she still did it. It was still a kind of necessity for her.
Yes. And in Time Flies, she talks about what she calls occupations and interruptions. And I think care is something she's thinking about when she's writing this. And she says we need to reframe our ideas about occupations and interruptions. And what we need to understand is sometimes the interruption is providential. So, you know, sent by God, because of course she's a Christian.
Yeah.
But in that way, maybe the interruption is what the day really has to teach us.
It's so interesting.
And
it's so different from that very expansive, kind of almost luxurious thing that Woolf talks about in A Room of One's Own, you know, having time and leisure and no kids and, you know.
Yes, I hadn't thought of that. Right.
It sounds like Rossetti's, the way she writes about it is much more accessible.
Yes.
It's much more likely that people will have that kind of life.
Yes.
Whether they are a parent or have aging parents. Or...
She didn't have a room of her own, really. So Diane D'Amico writes a great article about her house in Torrington Square in London, where she was looking after the aunts and her mother. And it was a movable feast, her writing. It was whoever wasn't occupying a room, you know, being looked after, because sometimes people were sick and on the ground floor, and then, you know, so she just wrote kind of all over
Whenever
the house.
Yeah.
Which is something I think we can all sympathize with.
Yeah, particularly now we're all working at home so much more.
Yes, and hot desking and all that stuff. You know, she was doing it then.
She was doing it then. She was a pioneer. Yeah. Great, thank you so much. And just about to wrap up, so I'm asking the same question of everyone, which is for someone wanting to get into poetry, do you have a poem or a poet that you would recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. I would recommend Brian Bilston, local poet, I think I can safely say, whose poem, I think it's called To-Do List, we often use in our workshops. And often it's the one we start with.
Wow.
Because it's humorous and accessible. And the poem is all about a numbered to-do list. But when you read it, you realize it's about procrastination and not doing the task.
That's brilliant. I constantly argue with my husband about whether a to-do list is actually procrastinating. I'm not a fan of to-do lists. And I find them quite stressful as well, actually.
Yes, and you feel you've failed when you don't cross everything off, and then the thing carries over into the next day.
Yeah.
I
think it was Edna Longley who said that every poem is about poetry, and in a way, that's a bit like a kind of poor reading of a poem. It sounds like, what do I need to do to get to the end of this poem? You know?
Yeah.
What are the kind of techniques I have to look for, rather than just read it, you know, just engage with it. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. Where could our listeners go to find out more about you and your projects?
Yes, please come visit us on carerspoetry.org, and you can see Carers poems. You can hear downloads of them actually reading their poetry, and you can find out how to join our workshops in future if that interests you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of our listeners. See you next time on Demystifying Poetry.